When we think about learning, the process that immediately springs to mind involves making links between previously unconnected things. We might, for example, learn the relationship between a button and what happens when you press it, or between a name and a person we just met. What we're learning here are associations between objects, or between actions or ideas, and this process is hence called associative learning. In the context of learning, a stimulus is any change in the environment that an animal senses. Examples include shapes, noises, smells, temperature, or any other aspect of the environment that can be detected. A response is any behavior an animal performs because of a stimulus. These can be unconditioned responses, which occur without any learning, or conditioned responses that occur only after an animal has learned. The basics of associative learning are straightforward. A stimulus or action that was previously neutral is identified as having a consequence that is positive or negative. This consequence is referred to as a reinforcer. After a number of repetitions, depending on the reliability and importance of the reinforcer, a long-term association is created between this previously neutral event and the result, and the animal changes its response to the event accordingly. Let's illustrate these terms using a hypothetical example. Imagine you're walking down a familiar street and hear a strange noise. A few seconds later, someone jumps out at you holding a bucket and drenches you with cold water. You'll probably flinch, you might yell. Both of these are unconditioned responses to the negative reinforcer of being cold and wet. The following day, you're walking down another street and you hear the same strange noise. What do? Do you ignore it, or do you immediately look around, run, or try to cover yourself up? That was a conditioned response. You learned an association between an unknown arbitrary sound and something happening, and it altered your response to the noise. Associative learning is often divided into two fundamental types, known as classical and instrumental conditioning. Classical conditioning involves making an association between a stimulus and a reinforcer, while instrumental conditioning involves associating an action with a reinforcer. Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian conditioning because of pioneering research in the early 20th century by Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. Pavlov's experiments involved teaching dogs associations between food and arbitrary stimuli, such as a bell. Pavlov would sound the bell and then give the dog some food, measuring its response in terms of the amount of saliva the dog produced. He found that over time the dogs would produce saliva in response to the bell alone, having formed an association between this stimulus and the positive reinforcer of food. Two other important concepts of learning are also illustrated within Pavlov's experiments: generalization and discrimination. These are opposite processes that govern how animals respond to stimuli that are similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus. Generalization occurs when animals respond to stimuli related to the one that was learned. For example, when trained on tones of a certain pitch, Pavlov's dogs would also salivate in response to tones of different pitches. As you might expect, tones that were more similar elicited a greater response. Discrimination occurs when an animal learns to focus on a specific stimulus, excluding similar stimuli. If only one of several similar tones leads to a food reward, over time, dogs will discriminate and only respond to the right tone. At this point, you might be asking, why is this important? Who cares whether dogs drool when you ring a bell? The reason is that these sorts of learning experiments are absolutely crucial for understanding animal senses and cognition. They allow us to test precisely how good animals are at distinguishing between different stimuli and how they use information about one stimulus to judge another stimulus. These are fundamental questions for understanding how animal minds work. Instrumental or operant conditioning initially seems quite different from classical conditioning, as it involves an association with an action rather than a stimulus. The classic example is the Skinner box, in which an animal such as a rat must press a lever in response to a light or sound to be rewarded with food. This time, the association forms between the action of pushing the lever and the stimulus of the light. As the rat learns, the association strengthens, and the rat presses the lever more often in response to the light. The difference between classical and instrumental conditioning is not always clear, as it's possible that what the rat's actually learning is an association between the stimuli associated with the lever and the reward. Thankfully, animal learning seems to follow the same rules when learning about both actions and stimuli. Associative learning seems to be a general mechanism animals use to link causal events. That's all for this video, although I've barely scratched the surface of how associative learning actually operates. The next time you have to learn something, have a think about how easy it was. Did it take several reinforcements to stick? Or did you learn it immediately? Do you think how easily you learned it was related to how complex or important the subject was? See you next time.